Hello innovators, I'm Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator. Today I'm talking with Zahra Davidson. She is the Chief Exec and Design Director of Enrol Yourself. So thank you for coming on to the Polymath Polycast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So we're here to talk about Enrol Yourself, with peer learning to meet the challenges of the 21st century together. And I think that's a great little quote I stole there for this intro because I thought it's a great way of approaching the modern era of education. So the way I like to break the ice is to have you share something about yourself that no one knows about you.
So I'm not sure that I'd say that no one knows this about me, but not everyone knows about me that I come from a Muslim family, so a British Muslim family in the UK. And so from next week, I'll be fasting during Ramadan. So I'm just sort of preparing for a month of fasting at the moment, preparing mentally. And yeah, that's perhaps a little bit unusual in the UK. So that's something.
Yeah, no, that's cool. And fasting is something that's really impressive when it comes to cultures from around the world. I know a lot of them do it, but Ramadan in particular is a very intense one. And you have to be careful to take care of yourself on top of that, but also just respect the culture that you're involved in, and you're trying to take care of yourself and take care of your beliefs. And I think it's interesting too, because it's a great way of cleansing your body as well, which I find really interesting.
Yeah, and that's very much how I see it every year. It's sort of an annual practice, which is a bit of a time to detox. So, literally things like coffee. I don't drink any coffee during that time because I can't drink it at night or I won't sleep. So I have this period where some things are just sort of cut out of my life or my diet entirely, and I value that detox.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't realize you would have to drink coffee at night, but that makes sense. And even decaf would have caffeine in it too, so you can't really have it at all. So.
Yeah.
Hello and welcome to the Polymath Polycast. Well, and speaking of a year ago, what was your mindset 5 years ago, and how have you changed since then?
That's a great question. I think because five years ago would have been before I started working on Enrol Yourself, or around the time that I did, just before. And I think my mindset at the time was very much one of, I'm a person that wants to make something. I want to make something in the world. I have a lot of energy, and I'd like to use that and do something with that. And I think whilst that might still be true of me, I think the way that my mindset has shifted around that has been that nowadays I think of that in a much more collaborative way. So I think now my mindset is much more one of, I want to build and create things with other people in collaboration, and as a collective effort and a collective practice, as well as an individual practice as a maker or a designer. I'm sure there have been other mindset shifts in that time as well, but that's sort of the one that really stands out.
Well, and just from your social profiles, it seems that the maker and creator mindset has definitely evolved. And I've seen the creativity with Enrol as well. Just the Huddlecraft book itself, too, was just creatively built, and the designs within it, let alone the designs on the website for Enrol. And I've always been kind of like the judge a book by its cover kind of thing, like literally a book, but also websites too, where if you see a website and it's designed in a modern sense with maybe not modern colors, if you will, but like a modern approach to color design. And that's one of the things I look out for. I'm like, hey, they actually put effort into a site like that. You can see it, you can feel it. I actually went with my podcast host purely because I felt that their modern approach to how they did their marketing and their website design showed that they cared and they were paying attention to the changes, which means that they were going to do that for me as well. And they did. Once Amazon Podcast came out, they got it real quick before a lot of other people did. And so I was able to be first on there versus a lot of other platforms that weren't. So I see that kind of thing, and I really respect it when I see it on a site like that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting observation and way of looking at it. And I think certainly with Huddlecraft and with making that book, which for anyone listening is a sort of a collection of some of our learnings and stories from Enrol Yourself since it began 4 or so years ago. And yeah, certainly with Huddlecraft, we really wanted that idea of craft to come through, and that idea of the sort of the creativity of peer groups, really, because part of the idea with our peer groups is that you're kind of bringing together this interesting mix of people, this sort of bubbling cauldron of ideas that you then get to spend time in over the course of a learning journey. And so we wanted that book, Huddlecraft, to be sort of fizzing with a sense of ideas and energy in the same way that a peer group does. So yeah, it was really fun to make.
Yeah. All right. Now we've done a wardrobe change. We're here on another day. We had a little bit of tech issues there. So thanks for checking in the PolyCast. So going back to that last question there, we can kind of finish what your thoughts were. What was your mindset 5 years ago, and how have you changed since then?
Yeah, so I would say that there have been a lot of mindset shifts over that period. But to focus on one to begin with anyway, I think 5 years ago, that would have been around the time I was starting to think about the idea for Enrol Yourself, my business. And I think at that point in time, it felt really, really important to say yes to everything, to say yes to every opportunity that came my way in terms of developing Enrol Yourself. And I think one of the shifts that I've been really needing to go through, particularly over the last couple of years, is a shift in state so that I'm no longer in that yes to everything mode. And I'm actually able to say no to some things and to focus more. And that feels like a step up that I need to make now that we're a few years old as an organization. And I think another mindset shift, which might be worth mentioning as well, is one where, I come from a design background, but I was also doing project management as well in order to lead design projects. And so I think I had more of a mentality 5 years ago that was about planning exactly where I wanted to get to and then working out how to get there. And I think the way that I work now is much more about planning some experiments or some tests or some prototypes that I can do quickly in the present that will give me information about where to go next, rather than sort of pre-deciding on that destination. So I guess that's sort of taking a more emergent approach, and that feels like a shift as well.
I love it, and thanks for saying yes to this too as well. And so it's interesting to think about the emergent shifts, and a lot of times I talk to people about this idea of a COVID accelerant too. So in the few years that Enrol has been around, you've also had to deal with COVID and how that changes as well. How have you responded, you and your business partner?
Yeah, so it has been a big change in some ways, and almost less of a big change than I would have imagined in other ways, so there's been a bit of both. But I think one of the big changes is that we've had to take all of our work online. So what we do is connect people into peer groups of adults who aid and exchange skills, resources, perspectives, creativity, etc. And before COVID, pre-COVID times, we were doing all of that face-to-face. So that was a sort of a core part of our model, really, was that we were connecting people locally so that they could have face-to-face interactions in that way. And as a result of the pandemic, we have taken all of that online. So we have trained our hosts, our facilitators who start our peer groups. We've trained them online, and then they have been connecting people into groups. we've been shifting everything online and learning how to practice our craft, if you like, in a way that works in the online space. I think some things are lost, but other opportunities are gained, and we've been working through all of that.
That definitely seems right. And the idea of like delegation with some of these group leaders, allowing you to kind of grow without you having to be there in the process as well.
Yeah. And I think, that's been an important part of the way that we've been working from almost the very beginning, because when you have the idea of learning through peer-to-peer relationships, that's inherently more distributed than a teacher-student model of education. And so when it came to thinking about, this peer group process that we've developed that seems to work and be effective for people, how do we replicate that? The most authentic answer has always been, who else wants to run processes like this, who could build on what we've learned and the resources that we've created? Can we train and equip them to run our peer groups, rather than it being something that we simply grow as an organization? So that sort of distribution of learnings and of agency is something that's really important for Enrol.
Yes. And I think the idea too, I love, like, you're speaking my language here, Zahra, on this show as well, because the whole idea of doing many different things, but distribution is often a great part of that, and learning as well. That's a big part of what PolyInnovator is about, is this idea of self-education or just changing education. And the way you're going about doing that with Enrol Yourself too, you and your partner as well, it's interesting how the distribution and making action based off of technology we have today, and actually changing the approach, using the technology we have, using the actions we can do in person or live online, and having the ability to make those connections and having the peer-to-peer learning as well.
Yeah, that's right. And I think technology has played a bigger role over the last year. And actually, that has shone a light on some new opportunities for us as well, in the sense that there are people who have been interested in our work and interested in whether they might participate for several years, but have been in the wrong location and so haven't been able to get involved. And so one of the benefits of technology becoming a bigger part of what we do is that we're actually able to be accessible to a wider range of people. So that's kind of a beautiful thing. And I think another benefit has been within the community of people who have over the last few years participated in our peer groups. We've been able to bring some of them together through our events program and things like that in a way that we couldn't really before, because some of them were in different locations, and face-to-face events were our norm. So there's been a real relationship building opportunity for us, even though obviously really miss those sort of face-to-face learning spaces as well, because that it is so powerful to be in a room with other people. But yeah,
it really is. Yeah, there is trade-offs. And I think, too, there might be time for lessons now that you can learn by increasing the amount of people that have access. You'll have more opportunities to see what works, what doesn't. Granted, the difference between live and online might make a difference there, but for the most part, you can experiment more and try new things, and you can take those lessons into the live lessons when we can go back to that as well.
Yeah, that's it. And yeah, I think the last year has been a very experimental time for us for several reasons, for those reasons we've already discussed, but also because our hosts, our Enrol Yourself hosts, who we've trained in our approach, they've been going through this transition with us, so right. When we trained them, it was a case of, this COVID stuff is happening right now, but we all hope we're actually going to be able to run our groups face to face. And then it quickly became clear, no, that's not going to be possible. You know, this is something that is going to have a much longer term impact than perhaps we originally thought. And so they have all been working out how to innovate the process that we have, how to change the resources so that they work in a digital space, how to change the message so that they can appeal to people and bring them into an experience that's going to be online. So they've all been sort of innovating, and we just kind of trying to learn from them and capture some of that learning along the way. But yeah, it will no doubt have been a really rich time in terms of what we learn about our craft and what we do.
Right. They're on the front lines of sorts. And let me ask you too, why is education so important, do you think?
Ooh. To the world in general?
In a very generalized sense is what I was kind of going for.
I mean, it cannot be understated, I think, is my response. You know, one of the sort of phrases that we use quite a bit at Enrol Yourself is finite planet, infinite potential to learn. And that's something that I really believe in, actually, that within people there is an infinite amount of possibilities for our individual and collective development. And so when you contrast that with all of the challenges that we are facing collectively, that's really hopeful. That paints a really hopeful picture to know that all of the potential is within us to learn to meet some of these challenges. And I think that really, you know, that goes across the entire life cycle of a human being, you know, from formal education in early years, in childhood, and then right through to lifelong learning space where, you know, that I work within. And,
well, let's touch on that then.
Yeah, go for it.
I think that there's 3 different levels. Something we'll talk about more later is like the idea of Enrol Yourself with a different lifelong learning. But the modular degree that I work on as well, I kind of thought of 3 different levels there. You have the boot camp style, which is quick pace, get a job kind of thing. You have the degree-like style, which is what we've used for centuries now, where you go and get a degree, you have a certain set of classes, or certain rules in place, constraints to get you to actually do it. But there's also the idea of lifelong learners. And I think as a species, which you might agree, we are learning species. We like to learn new things. And we kind of lost that in modern society, it seems like. A lot of people who pursue it are almost outliers in a way, despite the fact that being so prevalent in our DNA. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think that the career as a concept is so dominant. I mean, I can't speak for everyone in the world, right? But in Western society, the career is hugely dominant over the idea of a lifetime of learning. And of course, one doesn't negate the other. You know, if you have a fascinating and engaged career, no doubt that will involve all kinds of learning along the way. But I think what that means is that the sort of professional realm takes precedent over the learning realm in our lives. And so learning becomes instrumental to our professional work rather than something that we do for the love of learning. And, I think that has roots in our school system as well, because schools are designed oriented toward work as well.
Right.
So there's really something there for me about actually losing the idea of learning just purely for the enjoyment of it, for the love of learning.
Well, there's this idea of personal learning and professional learning, and there's too much of a distinction there when they really do come together. And if you look at like the concept of ikigai, where it's the combination of all your different aspects of life coming together for your reason for being, well, you have to learn. You have to actually practice and do things, which are actions of learning, basically, like doing stuff like, hey, I took this task and made me think this is a good vocation, but I don't really enjoy doing it. Well, I enjoy doing this. How can I combine those? And eventually you get to the point where you find your ikigai, but that has to come really from lifelong learning.
Yeah. And I heard about a study recently. I don't know all of the fine details of it, but essentially it was comparing elderly people and their sort of predisposition for Alzheimer's, comparing elderly people when they were living within community kind of environments where they were learning more, where they were engaging more with other humans, where they were faced with more challenges day to day, comparing that setting in old age with a setting of sort of routine, possibly one other person that they see on a daily basis doing the same kinds of things and not really testing themselves or challenging themselves anymore. And there are real medical, physical differences in the brains of people who continue to stretch themselves. And so it's not only about, well, do I want to live a long life myself? It's also about the societal impact of that as well, because if we all continue to learn, that is less strain on our health systems and so on. So it's not just a nice to have to be thinking about learning.
Well, if you look at like the Okinawans and over in Japan where the Ikigai is from, it's interesting how those are some of the people that live the longest in the world. Like, they have like the densest population of people who are over 100. And it's because they're able to, not only that too, they're all cognizant, they're not having Alzheimer's or dementia, or at least most of them aren't, because they're able to keep learning and keep engaging the mind and keeping that neuroplasticity going. I think I saw that study you're talking about at some point there, where the more you're engaging the mind, the less likely you're to develop Alzheimer's. This is one reason why I think video games are so great for a lot of people of older demographic, because they can stimulate their brains more and get that hand-eye coordination as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. And yeah, I think it's kind of, I think there can be an assumption as well that when we talk about lifelong learning, we mean intellectual pursuits, but it really, it really isn't limited to that, right? Like at the moment, I'm learning two things which are sort of at that mind-body connection. So one of those is rollerblading, and the other one is djembe drumming.
That's cool.
And that kind of learning is really, really different from some other kinds of learning that I engage in. And I think that breadth and that variety is also is part of the picture as well.
Oh, you're speaking my language here again. It's like catnip for me. Thank you. And I think too, I actually wanted to ask you as well, can you tell me more about your learning journey? I'm curious about that.
Yeah. And I have to start really right at the beginning, I think, with that, because I think that I've been very fortunate to have quite an unusual setting growing up where I grew up in a family of white Muslim converts. And so growing up in the UK, I've sort of been part of two cultures simultaneously. I think that sort of set the scene for quite an interesting learning journey from the beginning. And then I had, as a primary school, like a really interesting school in the UK called Dolphin School, which was actually started by an American woman who, as I understand it, came to the UK, had children here, was unsatisfied with the school system or with what she could find. And so she founded a school here to do things in a different way or in a better way. And so I was aware from quite a young age that in comparison with friends that I had in other schools and this kind of thing, that the school that I was at did things differently. So a few examples would be that we didn't have uniforms and we were allowed to call our teachers by their first name rather than by
I love it.
By their formal name. We did art and drama and Latin, and they did Greek and all this kind of thing from a really young age. So the curriculum was really broad. So that was a sort of like a fantastic initiation into the breadth of what education can be. And then I also, I went to art school. So after school, I went to university and studied graphic arts and communication. And art school is just a great learning environment. And, I always found it amazing at the time, and even now when people look back on their sort of academic university education, just the comparison is crazy. You know, the friends of mine who'd be studying, I don't know, history or economics or something like that, they'd go to a couple of lectures a week and that was it, and they'd sit down on a chair and be spoken to by a lecturer, whereas at art school we were expected to be in all day every day in the studio with our peers. You know, there were printing rooms and photography rooms and the IT rooms and everything, and so we were immersed in a collaborative learning environment all day every day. So
studio-esque kind of thing where you're all just working together. It reminds me of Da Vinci, where like when he worked under Verrocchio, he was in a studio like that where everyone's just together, working together, learning how to paint side by side, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think it's the being together is such a huge part of that as well. So you know, I'm really interested in the idea of homeschooling, for example, but it is also something that I feel quite skeptical about. Obviously, this picture has changed radically over the last year as well because of COVID, and so many people have been doing that wouldn't have done it before. But I think that sort of socialization of children at a young age is probably the most important part of their education, possibly, you know.
Well, and just like some of the friends I made in elementary school are the ones I'm most close with now today. And yet the ones I got really close with in like secondary school, for example, not necessarily talking to nowadays because there wasn't enough connection between you. You weren't spending as much time together. And it's interesting too how when you're learning something on your own with somebody else, I guess you could say, like on your own as an outside the system, I mean, you have that connection like, hey, we're learning this together, and you have this camaraderie. And one thing I've noticed too, after talking to people from around the world, is that in Asia and Europe in particular, they're experimenting a lot more when it comes to learning methodologies. So someone told me about how in some secondary schools in Europe, they do kind of a cross-pollination thing where if you're learning history, if you're learning chemistry, you look at it from a history point of view. If you're learning law, you'll look at it from an economics point of view. Or if you're learning biology, you'll learn the chemistry aspect behind it first. And you're taking these concepts and learning them from a different disparate field and taking it from different viewpoints, allowing for interdisciplinary learning. And like in China, for example, too, they're learning, a lot of these kids are learning sports or music and video games and actual mathematics too as well, and just having all these different fields of knowledge coming together. I think that interdisciplinary learning is very interesting as too.
Yeah, and you know that also reminds me of the primary school that I went to as well, because the way that they would do the curriculum for a year would be with a theme that would span across all of the subjects. So the one that I actually remember was that there was some kind of like space, you know, like cosmic kind of theme for 1 year. And so you would learn science through that lens, or you would learn maths through that lens, or history.
I love that.
And I think that's really powerful because it actually gives context to those subjects. You know, when you hear people say things a lot like, well, I don't know why I learned that, or I've never used that again, or whatever. So doing that with a theme is a way of weaving things together, knitting them together, making them make sense. Yeah. It's
perfect for the show, though, because the whole polymathic mindset, like bringing things together and approaching all these different cookie jars at once, so to speak, or coming from a lens. If you have a specialty, that's great. You can learn a wide range of things using that specialty as like the catalyst of trans-contextual thinking, where you're, for example, my first job was lifeguarding, so swimming was a big part of that. I became a swim instructor quickly after that, and I was able to use swimming as a basis for learning so many different other things, which just seems crazy to think about, but physics, psychology, and even philosophy are a great way for me to bounce off to other areas of swimming into these different areas. And it's interesting how you can take that interdisciplinary mindset.
Yeah, and within Enrol Yourself as well, what we do is have learning questions. So everyone who joins one of our peer groups brings a learning question, which is in a way similar to having a thesis question or a research question. But what's really important with the learning question is that it connects to something that's very important for that individual at that time. And it's also really important that they select that question, and it could relate to something professional, like how do I change my career towards this particular area, or it could be something much more personal, like how do I overcome anxiety I feel with public speaking, or whatever it might be. It gives each person a sort of like a lens or an anchor, and their learning might take them in different directions. But that question remains that sort of anchor point through which they can access sort of lots of different content or different approaches or knowledge from different fields. And I think one of the things that we always find is that, people have really different questions in peer groups, but it works because every question is a sort of a doorway into every other question, and there are always connections that can be drawn, in the same way that you talk about sort of swimming and how that might be connected to lots of different fields of study. You can always draw these fascinating connections between people's different interests.
Right.
Yeah.
I had a guest who, Alex Dunstan, he talks about Linky brains, or people who make connections between them, or scanners and stuff like that too, where there's a lot of different terms for people like this. But I think polymathic people often see those connections more easily, but everybody, I think, has the capacity for that, in my opinion at least. And it's interesting too, like making those connections, the systematic thinking, I think is really key to that. And given the importance of interdisciplinary learning to enroll yourself, what do you think it takes to follow an interdisciplinary lifestyle?
Some luck to begin with, to to be given the opportunity in your life to be able to follow threads of interests, multiple threads of your interests, and really run with those. I think there's inherently privilege involved in being able to do that. And then I think, again, I would say, there's a really social aspect to all of this. And I think if you're surrounded by people who are interested in lots of different things, that will feed your own polymathic learning practice. And if you're only surrounded by people who operate within one discipline or one field of study or within one profession, that won't feed a interdisciplinary practice in the same way. So I think really taking an intentional approach to surrounding yourself with people who have different backgrounds, different perspectives, different practices, that's the strongest way that I know about for sort of living that lifestyle.
Yeah. Well, and peer-based learning, too, is a big part of your work there. And I think that there's a saying that goes around, like, who you surround yourself is, you're like, no, hold on. You are the sum of who you surround yourself with. And so if they're very limited into one trench mindset, they're not going to necessarily be as open-minded, perhaps. And so you might surround yourself with that closed-minded thinking and prevent that growth mindset from flourishing. So that's one point of view, too, to think about.
Yeah. And I also think, without even being closed-minded, just by virtue of being only with others who have the same mindset as you and the same perspective, the result might be that collectively you are not that open-minded because you're quite homogenous, so it might not necessarily reflect, on those individuals that they're not open-minded, or certainly not that they don't have the capacity to be open-minded. But I think, the power of peer groups and the power of any environment where you actually have different perspectives and different backgrounds and so on, is that it's then an unstoppable force that your mind is opened. As long as you're actually listening to the other people around you, your mind will be opened because you're hearing these different things, and it's very hard to sort of stop that process once it's underway.
Right. And it's interesting, too. I wasn't trying to say anything about being a specialist makes you closed-minded or something like that. But you made a good point, too, is that like when you're coming together, regardless of closed mindset, growth mindset, or specialist, or polymath, there's this idea of that compounding effect when you work together and having that brainstorm of groups coming together and ideas coming together.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what happens in our peer group sometimes is that I've seen this dynamic quite a few times where you'll have a group and you'll have a few people who are what I would term as overachievers. So people who are really, really busy, doing everything, involved in loads of stuff professionally. And then they might come together with people who have great boundaries around work, for example. And there's often this kind of amazing thing where the people who are incredibly busy look at the people who have got boundaries nailed a little bit more and they go like, wow, how are you doing that? Tell me how you approach that. And then this kind of exchange happens. And what I realized is that the reason it's such a kind of incredibly eye-opening moment is because people do end up sort of sticking to other people who behave a bit like them, or they attract other people to them who behave a bit like them. And so often the overachievers hang out with loads of overachievers. And so then to bring them into a space, you know, where there's real difference is kind of a moment of real like, whoa, other people approach the world differently. So actually I have more choices than I thought I did, you know? Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, too, because even right now, you and I talking, we both have this excitement for learning and excitement for lifelong learning in particular. And we have different approaches to it. And we're learning from each other's approaches. Our conversation is evolving and having that excitement grow more and more as we talk. And like, I'm sitting here in a state of flow because I'm like, okay, this is really interesting. I can see her opinion and see how they approach things. And I think that's an important distinction, too. Just like conversations.
Yeah, and I guess I'm interested then to ask you, like, in what way would you approach some of this stuff differently, or where might you be coming from a different perspective? That would be really interesting to hear.
Yeah, well, and I think that I was trying to adapt a degree-like structure, whereas I think you came from the lifelong learning perspective. Personally, my motivation was lifelong learning, but I actually tried to, I guess, cater to the traditional way of learning a little bit more from what I can tell, just because I was thinking, like, how can we change the way of education through the old system to replace the old system? Or saying yours is more of an alternative, if for a much better alternative, mind you, as well. But I don't know. You might agree, you might disagree. I'm curious to see what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I think that's interesting the way you framed it, and yeah, I think there's also an interesting question in there, isn't there, about, you know, if you're working on an alternative, does that inherently mean that you know that you are trying to change the system? And I think that's been an ongoing question for us. You know, it's how much we are opposed to what is there currently versus just building something that we think is effective and that we think is exciting.
Yeah, it is a very good question. I mean, just to put it in perspective, my motivation was that I looked at universities throughout the world for a smart city degree. That was the degree that I wanted, but it's a field that's not necessarily developed so much yet. I wanted to be like a smart city manager or a project management manager of sorts for that kind of field. And now there's a place in Spain that does a degree for it at master's level, but at the time there was nothing. And so I just decided, screw it, I'm going to make my own degree using resources online. And I already spent a ton of time learning about like content marketing and stuff like that. There's stuff I was interested in, but the fields of like sustainability or green tech or circular economies, stuff like that, I had to learn. And so I created a list of courses. I made it into a degree-like structure because that's what I knew. But I think that there's other ways of going about it, which is why I mentioned boot camp or lifelong learning too earlier, because I think there's 3 different levels to it, maybe more even.
And can I ask you, how was the experience of motivating yourself in that process? And would you consider yourself as sort of someone who has unusually high levels of self-motivation or not? I'd be interested.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because I don't know if I can say I'm super high motivated, because there's plenty of times where I don't want to sit here and edit a video every week or something like that, and I can't motivate myself to do it, although having the accountability to guests is a great motivator. But there was also a day when I still was looking at colleges, I needed to have history. So they wanted me to do calculus because I was looking at computer science for some reason at the time. And so I was studying calculus. I was teaching myself calculus despite my history of math being pretty poor. And throughout that week, I was learning how to find the derivative and calculate the integral for calculus. And it's like, how am I figuring this stuff out? Well, I was able to sit there for a long period of time and just absorb the knowledge first. And I remember one Wednesday waking up at 8 a.m. and studying, besides 1 hour break for lunch, until like basically 14 hours later. I spent like 13, 14 hours learning calculus one day because I had time. And so that's a great motivator. But then on other cases, I'm not learning at all. I think it goes in ebbs and flows too. That's one thing to think about, is cycles of learning.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that's something we're interested in at Enrol Yourself as well, is sort of how can we borrow from nature's patterns in some ways. So seasons is a particularly powerful idea for learning, and for sort of team building and the way you work as an organization as well. But I've been trialing sort of just for myself this year, thinking about some of the things that I'm learning and some of the things that I'm interested in, thinking about that seasonally rather than trying to sort of do everything at once and be interested in everything at once. And I've been finding that really, really positive, you know, to think, well, this month I'm in running season and I want to run 10K. I want to reach that goal. And then after that, I'm going to move into a different season and I'm going to focus on something else. And I think that's really helped me focus with some things, actually.
Well, yeah. Kind of like a season of a show, for example, or having the theme of, like you said, cosmos, and for that year was kind of like that was your season. Your season was the cosmos or the astronomy, I mean, of that point, or something like that, taking a space approach. And
yeah,
that makes me think too, like when I made my modular degree, I organized it via semesters using that same kind of logic of a traditional degree. But I've also realized now that I made a template for people to use is that it really doesn't matter what taxonomy you use to organize it. You could use semesters, you could use seasons. At one point, I was even thinking about just subject matter, like I wanted to learn this subject, and that's my organization. And then the next subject, that's my organization. When you mentioned seasons, it actually made me think of the actual literal seasons of like summer, winter, fall, and spring. When the wintertime comes, my energy levels deplete. I have a really hard time doing anything, let alone learning. So I wonder if that might be an interesting topic too.
Yeah, definitely. And actually that is what I was referring to, is those sort of, you know, like the seasons of the year. And I think that can be a way to structure learning modules in the kind of way that you're talking about. But I also think I imagine a learning cycle as almost being quite seasonal as well. So in our peer groups, we guide people through a process with their learning question where they are sort of exploring it to begin with in quite a divergent way, and then they begin to respond to it. So they begin to converge some ideas and respond to the question, whether that means making something, doing something, setting something, whatever it might be. And that kind of mode, that making mode or that producing mode, is like summer, right? Or, you know, spring, summer, the idea of sort of fruiting, coming to fruition with something. And then after that, you have something that you can reflect on. And so that's kind of like autumn, when the leaves fall, and ultimately those decomposing leaves are going to feed the roots of the tree again, and that's going to enable the tree to fruit again. So yeah, I think these analogies are really powerful ways of thinking about learning.
Well, and I really curious to think about too is that input and output. I've been learning a lot about Notion, which is a tool you can organize your life with and create this like life operating system. I love it. I think you do too. And it's just one of those things where I've been looking at people's methods. Like there's the para method, like the projects, areas, resources, and archives. And most of these systems are meant for input, a slow burner, and then output. And I think there's also a point of like reflection and planning as well. So spring is like the planning, summer is the output, fall is reflection, and then winter is the like taking a rest moment or maybe input stage or something like that, depending on how your seasons go.
Yeah. And I think the rest aspect is often the bit that gets completely omitted, because I think, what Western society and capitalism
go
invokes is perpetual summer, being in a mode of perpetually needing to provide fruit. And so I think, that can be, well, at best draining and at worst really, really damaging.
I hit a burnout at one point because I kind of kept that mindset of go. And when I burned out, it was really hard to recover back into a production or normal state. And it's just like the flow state, like I mentioned earlier, like I'm in the flow talking with you and having a good conversation, is that when you get into this high state of focus or hypermentality, there's actually a recovery state afterwards, which most people don't know about or realize. And so you have to actually rest after you get that super rush of focus and energy. You have to let yourself recover from that.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've been, really interested, I mean, obviously it's horrible, but interested to learn more about over the last year has been those who have the long COVID symptoms and people in general who suffer worse from post-viral conditions in general. That coincides with people who are doing too much, who are too busy, who are burnt out, this kind of thing. And so again, it's that kind of thing where really taking rest seriously as part of a learning process or a work process is actually preventative of some serious health conditions and all kinds of stuff. So,
well, they say stress is really hard on the body too, especially when you're recovering.
Yeah. And I listened to a podcast recently about stress that I really enjoyed because it sort of gave more nuance, I suppose, to my understanding of when stress can be damaging. And what it was saying was stress itself is not damaging to the body, but it's when you don't process that stress and allow it to pass through. So if those hormones and everything get sort of stuck in the body, that is damaging. Your body can take a fluctuation from sort of a stress response and back again.
Right.
And that won't damage you. But if you don't complete the stress cycle, if you don't process the stress, if you don't let it pass through, that is really bad for you.
Meditate or prayer on it too, and that way you can have that kind of connection. You mentioned earlier the mind-body connection too, and this touches on my 4 pillars philosophy, where it's the 4 major aspects of life and understanding how they all balance the mind, body, spirit, and emotions. And regardless of a religion, you can apply that to your system of life and understand, like, what pillars do I need to build up? What pillars do I need to learn about and actually put into my cycles?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think people are different and they see things differently, but I do think that particularly learning socially with others, can be a spiritual experience. And I think I don't mean a religious experience, but I mean in terms of it being a place where you can actually do some of that development of spirit as well as development of intellect or development of practical skills or whatever it might be.
Well, and it's interesting you make the spiritual connection because I make an emotional connection. I think it's just I've always been more gregarious and socialite, and social butterfly, if you will. And so when I'm around people, it makes me happier and it puts me in a better mood. And so it's interesting to think about the spirituality aspect because obviously being around people you like will make you physically more responsive and mentally more responsive. But I think a lot of people miss the spiritual and emotional side. Yeah,
and I also think the spirit can be so lifted as well in the same way as the emotions and everything else by being with others and by having an opportunity to grow. So I think all of those things are so sort of interconnected.
Yeah. So pivoting a little bit here, something I ask all my guests is, what is a polymath to you?
Yeah, I think it's somebody that has what I would call a fizzy mind. And by fizzy, I literally mean like a fizzy drink where all the little bubbles are sort of sparkling and jumping off one another and popping and all of that kind of thing. I think a polymath to me is someone who can't help but be interested in almost anything. So it's really about that that curiosity, and I suppose the sort of flexibility that leads to as well.
I love that, and that's a great way of like thinking about it. And when you said fizzy too, it made me also think of like the peer groups for Enrol, where all these different minds are coming together and like bubbles of ideas coming together too. That's just a picture that came to mind.
Yeah, and another sort of analogy for a peer group as well that I like is a cauldron. So if you imagine sort of a witch mixing potions into a cauldron, there's something similar with a peer group where it's like you're mixing these different people and their essences and their ideas and their perspectives, and you're sort of mixing that up in a way that probably wouldn't happen if it weren't for that peer group existing, and all of the sort of potential and possibilities that produces. Well,
and something I haven't given too much thought of is peer-based learning for the mod degree. And I was going to ask you too, it seems that obviously peer-based learning is so important to Enrol's structure. What have you learned as an education platform about getting peers to come together and how it works and the logistics almost of it too?
It's a great question. So I think I've learned about, mechanical things like group sizes and stuff like that. So I think that the ideal size for a peer group is probably 8 to 10, although we go up to a dozen people. So we go to 12 as well, and our process is designed to hold that. But actually, the more that each person can really get under the skin of the others and get to know them and have a relationship with them, the better. So small groups are really important for peer-to-peer work. I think when you get past a certain size, it can't be truly sort of seen as peer-to-peer or not in the same way anyway. And definitely on Zoom at the moment, I like to make sure that even for a workshop or something like that I'm ideally working with a group who I can all see their faces at the same time on one screen, and I don't have to click an arrow to go through,
That is interesting.
So, yeah.
I was just going to mention that, like, the year before COVID, before everyone was on Zoom and all this stuff, I was using Zoom for my school. I did a stint at a unique kind of college that was taking a modern approach to the neuroscience of learning too. And they built a video platform for their online classes because it was all online school. And they had the slides to the left, a teacher and a big camera on the top. On the right, there was a chat, but beneath the teacher was all the students on a revolving camera. So, not camera, but revolving little section there. So that way, at least every few seconds, you can see all the students. It's called The Forge by Foundry College. And it was interesting. It's like you could see all the students at once. Eventually, it would go on to breakouts. So you can see, obviously, like in Zoom has breakouts too. But you can see all the students at once. So that way, too, you can see people's faces. That's great.
Yeah, because I've often as a host on Zoom, when I put people in breakout rooms, I want to be able to see a dashboard where I can see a mini version of each of the breakout rooms, and each of them is silent, but I can kind of zoom into one of them or zoom back out again. So maybe that sounds a little bit closer to what I'm imagining.
And I don't know what the teachers see, basically. Like, I would presume perhaps the teacher gets to see pockets of those little groups on their screen. I don't know exactly how. They didn't ever explain that part to us students, but I think that's the most efficient way of being able to see all breakout rooms kind of organized with little cameras underneath for each student, too, talking.
Yeah, because that's one of the most artificial things about doing things online is just that sort of invisibility, that kind of who is listening to me right now whilst I'm talking, or it feels so unnatural still, even after almost 18 months.
Well, and before we wrap up too, something about the marathons for Enrol caught my eye, and the idea of peers, projects, and paths. What caused you to, what was the cause of having that 1, 2, 3 system?
Yeah, and so just to explain it, those are the sort of the three pillars of the learning marathon process. So learning marathon is the name that we give to a 6-month structure that our peer groups go through, and peers, project, and path are the three sort of core pillars of that experience. So the peers are the people that you are with in your group. The project is what you work on, so your learning question and everything you do to explore and respond to that question. And then the path is the 6-month structure. So that's a series of different meetups and activities that you do with your group as well. And yeah, I mean, really the function of that is to try and break down what the process consists of so that it's easy for people to grasp and understand, because a lot of the time peer learning is not something that people are as familiar with, and people come with a lot of preconceptions about what learning is and how it should be done. So breaking it down makes it easier for us to kind of introduce people to this slightly new way of doing things.
Well, and we talked about kind of the alternatives to learning too, or just doing a new way of doing it, like a new way of approaching education is what we're going for here. And I think that's really interesting. And I mentioned swimming earlier, and our brains like threes, like 3, 6, 9, but especially threes. And so I think what you're doing there is really interesting, because I did the same thing with swimming. Years back, I came up with this like 3 simple steps to swimming: legs, face, and arms. Kicking the legs straight, face down, then getting the arms out of the water, diving them back in. And it's this 1, 2, 3 process that you can follow in your head without even me being there per se, teaching you, and just having that, like, okay, I can follow the system. I don't have to remember it per se. I just have to remember that 1, 2, 3, and I'll fall. If I need help, I can get it back up.
Yeah. And I think we try and encourage all of our hosts to communicate some aspects of their learning marathon in no more than 3s as well. So we have a webpage template that they all use to advertise and share their peer group and get people involved. And we've limited in the template a lot of the sections to things in 3s. So 3 reasons that you should do this learning journey, you know. And the host was sort of saying, but the word limit, I want to put 5 things, there are 10 reasons. And it's saying, well, actually, you can't tell people 10 reasons because the human brain just cannot take that level of information when it's encountering something for the first time. You know, you have to lead people into the shallow end of the swimming pool, isn't it? Right.
Well, it's all about chunks too. And one last question before we wrap up here. What is next for you? Where do you hope to take Enrol or your life?
So, I mean, I'm definitely all in at Enrol Yourself. So my next steps are definitely there. So right now, we have a bunch of open that people can join. Some of those are starting very soon and others are starting later in the year in September. And a lot of those are online. So we're sort of working through that process. And then I'm really interested in developing a lighter touch, lighter commitment version of the Learning Marathon. So a new product, essentially. So we're in the very early stages of developing that right now, which is exciting. And we're also developing a sort of an intensive training workshop that we're going to do this autumn, which is going to be all about huddlecraft. So that's the term we're giving to sort of the art and craft of designing and learning within groups in the way that you and I have been discussing. And we're going to offer that to sort of educators, learning and development people, learning designers, etc. And yeah, in the long term, let's see how much influence we could have over some of the more damaging and less inspired aspects of the education system.
Right. Well, and it seems too, we didn't get to touch on Huddlecraft much today, so maybe next time I have you on or something like that. And it seems like that you're kind of going for those quicker ones too. We mentioned how there's like 3 levels to the mod degree. I think there's multiple levels to Enroll Yourself as well, at least in the future. That's kind of what my brain thinks of. And I love how you're experimenting and trying new things and trying to get more people and more inclusivity behind it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, and that's definitely part of the vision as well, because I think that, you know, if I'm brutally honest with myself, like the future is uncertain, and so in order to survive as an organization as well, there needs to be several strings to our bow that will give us more resilience. So
for sure.
Yeah.
Well, where can people find you online?
They can find us at enrolyourself.com. And for all your Americans, Enrol has 1 L in the UK, not 2. So that's where you can find us.
Well, I'll have links in the description for you there. What could be like a call to action for the audience today then?
Oh, well, I mean, if you're listening and thinking, well, peer group cauldron of fascinating people with different perspectives sounds right up my street, then check out the learning marathons that we've got going on, because they're open. A lot of them are open globally. And if you're more broadly just interested in learning as a lifelong pursuit, I guess my call to action is always, don't do it alone. Find ways to join up with others, because I think you multiply your possibilities and your potential that way, as well as building relationships, which is a beautiful thing. So
it really is.
Yeah,
I love that. So once again, this is Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator, and Zahra Davidson on the Polymath Polycast. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.